Now whenever we talk about the beginning of ancient India, सबसे पहली चीज हमारे दिमाग में क्या आती है? Who are these modern historians who have talked about us, right? So we talk about this modern historiography. So whenever we talk about this, we come out with 4 basic schools. सबसे पहले स्कूल को हम क्या बोलते हैं? Colonialist school, है ना? The approach, we'll talk about it. The second approach, which was a counter to the first one, it was a nationalist approach. Third approach, which was seen in writing history in India, that was the Marxist approach. And finally, the approach which is getting the maximum attention in these times, this approach is known as subaltern approach. अब NCERTs में actually ये इस तरीके से नहीं दिया हुआ था. Like if we read R.S. Sharma says colonial approach, nationalist approach, then he says non-political history, and finally he says communal approach. Now communal approach is something which is not considered as a very good kind of way of writing history. So that's why the latest modern approach, this is the subaltern approach. तो आप भी ये 4 approaches याद रखेंगे. I'll show you some previous year questions on this after our initial discussion. कि ऐसे question भी पहले UPSC ने पूछे हुए हैं, ठीक है? But anyway, whenever we talk about history in India, the history writing, the process of history writing has always been contested. Somebody says history writing, there was a traveler known as Alberoni. Alberoni visited India and he said that Indians do not know how to write history. इन लोगों को कुछ नहीं आता. They love only one thing, that is the religion. They stay fixed towards that, and everything else that they have put not much attention. Same ideologies, it was also borrowed by the British. The British also borrowed the same ideology. What was this ideology? That history has been mostly a Islamic heritage. If we see the works of Barni, Afif, or Abul Fazl, these were the people who brought the tradition of history writing to India. However, when we go in deeper into the approach, we come out with various elements of history writing and we differentiate between historical consciousness and history writing as an art. We come to the understanding that Indians were always having historical consciousness. कि हमारे पास ये बहुत पहले से थी. Like if we see Vedas also, Puranas also, there have been always elements of historical consciousness. Right? What is the meaning of historical consciousness? It means remembering the past. Like even if we see epics, what do these epics do? They try to remember the India's heritage. That's why India was having historical consciousness. And within history writing also, if we see the analysis of Romila Thapar says that there are 2 types of societies. Those who are state-based society like China. State-based society means जहाँ पे state बहुत ज़्यादा powerful रहती है. And second types of societies are like India, जिसमें सबसे ज़्यादा famous क्या होता है? Lineage, है ना? चाचा विधायक है हमारे. So lineage-based societies, which will always first think about lineage, then they will think about the state. So in those kinds of societies which are lineage based like India, history writing is always going to be embedded in nature. Embedded means the main theme of the history writing may be religious, like we see Vedas. Veda is a religious text, but it still contains some elements of history. Buddhism also has large amount of religious text, but it still contains certain history. So such kind of history writing, it is known as embedded form. ये keywords आप याद रखना शुरू करेंगे, ठीक है? ये जो words मैं use कर रहा हूँ आपके लिए, embedded form. Embedded means that history writing, history as a subject is not developing independently. It's a part of some other part. Like if we see Veda, तो Vedas के अंदर there is history, but it is not directly given attention to. बस करते करते लिख दिया गया है. While these kinds of societies like China, they have the form which is known as externalized form of history. Externalized form means that history as a subject has developed independently. See the infrastructure of today's history writing. अगर आज की हम history writing की बात करते हैं, history लिखी कैसे जाती है? History लिखी कैसे जाती है? It's a very scientific process. We see what are the sources we have for that phase for which we're going to write history, we'll see the literary source, we'll see the archaeological source, and eventually what we're going to do, then something will also depend upon our approach, which school we are following out of these four, and eventually we'll start writing the history, and these are going to be our interpretations. So today the history writing, it's very professional in nature, but in India during the ancient times, history writing was more of an appendage. So that's why this form of history writing was known as embedded form of history. Anyway, why I am giving you this perspective, because when we talk about these schools, the first school, which is known as Colonial School, this was trying to degrade India, and this degradation could be seen by the various historians. Like we have famous historians like Max Muller. Okay, so Max Muller wrote about India, and what did it do? It did the criticism. उनको सिर्फ एक ही काम में focus था जब Maxley, that was criticism of indigenous cultures and praise of Western culture. So there were two aims, simultaneous aims, कि India के culture को degrade करना है and side by side West के culture को increase करना है. So what was the logic behind this? Because they were trying to somehow make Indians feel that you people are inferior, we are superior to you. That's why what you should do, you should accept our colonial rule. So this history writing, even though this became systematic by the time of the British, we were having a history writing, but it was not externalized form, it was of embedded form. So you should know. So they stated that ancient Indians lacked of history, especially of the factor of time and chronology. इन पे इन लोगों ने ध्यान ही नहीं दिया लिखते वक्त. They added that Indians were accustomed to despotic rule. The Western scholars stress that Indians had neither experienced feelings of nationhood nor any kind of self-government. So biggest problem with this colonial school was the research was not done in depth. है ना, आधा कच्चा जो भी मन में आया लिख दिया, and eventually there was only one objective of this school, and that major objective was to justify the colonial rule, कि ये लोग शांति से हमारी बातें accept कर लें. So here we have Max Muller, then we also have people like V.A. Smith, okay, Vincent Arthur Smith. He is going to be a very important personality. Lots of historical opinions have come from V.A. Smith. He was also a part of the same school. Now he has written this book known as Early History of India. He was a very loyal member of the civil services, which all of you want to become a part of, and at that time the character was different. His book, if you see ancient India, 1/3 of his book was linked to Alexander's invasion. 1/3. अगर हम आज एंशिएंट इंडिया की बुक कोई भी उठाएंगे, एनसीईआरटी लो, उपिंदर सिंह लो, कोई भी बुक लो, कितने पेजेस मिलते हैं अलेक्जेंडर के इन्वेजन को? एक या दो पेज, दैट्स इट. बट दिस पर्सन V.A. Smith gave 1/3 of his book, the early history of India, to Alexander's invasion. Even we know that the profound impact that they are trying to portray for Alexander invasion, it was missing. There was no direct confrontation with any of the major Indian society. There was no major confrontation with the empire of the time, the Nanda Empire, and eventually thereafter we see the rise of Mauryas. But still they choose to give maximum attention to Alexander's invasion. What was the major reason behind it? The major reason was to justify the European rule. So we were able to understand that by these Europeans, whatever history that they are writing, they are not writing for India's sake. They are not helping us in revealing about ourselves. That is not their objective. Their major objective is only one, and that objective is to make us feel inferior in all ways. Then India was presented as a land of despotism which didn't experience political unity until the establishment of British rule. Because initially when they were writing about Indian history, they had no clue about Ashoka, they had no clue about Mauryas, right? We'll see later on that by 1838, James Prinsep was able to decipher the Brahmi script. So whatever history has been written before 1838, that history has having different kinds of connotation, and this is the most important part of, or the conclusion of that part, that India was not having political unity. Because in India, if we talk about political unity, maximum political unity has happened during the times of Mauryas in ancient India. That's why whatever is written by these British people without understanding is something which is pure unnecessary interpretation. So these interpretations of Indian history served to denigrate Indian character, or in a way destroy Indian character and achievements and justify the colonial rule. They served as good propaganda material for the perpetuation of despotic British rule. This was the first approach towards India's history writing, and this was a very biased approach. The approach was very clear कि Indians को किसी भी तरीके से हमने नीचे दिखाना है, so that we can justify the colonial rule. This approach will discuss even later. जब मेन क्लासेस के अंदर जाएंगे तो इसके अंदर और अंदर बात करेंगे, right? Like in NCRTs, you'll see there were some positive contributions of the first school. सबसे बड़ा अगर पॉजिटिव का बात करें, नेगेटिव तो हमें समझ में आ गया that they are giving maximum kind of weightage to the European events even in Indian history. They are going to justify that India is not having self-governance. They will always say India is bound to have despotic rulers just like the British were. But there were certain positives, like number one, they ensured translations of various important Indian texts like Manu Smriti, Ramayana, Mahabharata. So those translations helped us in understanding about ourselves, Bhagavad Gita. Second, they try to create a conscious history. Okay. Previously, the history writing, even though it was there in India, it was of which form? Embedded form. Now they're trying to create a final history for India. Even though it was biased in nature, but in the long run, this was bound to help us because we'll learn about India. Then, decipherment of various important events of Indian history which was not known by that time. Like if we talk about Mauryas, the rule of Ashoka, Indus Valley civilization, all those things which were shrouded in the mystery, those things came into the picture. Like when we talk about today Indus Valley civilization, John Marshall played a very important role, and this is how the discovery of Indus Valley civilization was announced. So many new elements of Indian history, they came to the limelight during the British rule itself. So we cannot say that everything which has been done by them, it was of no use. Yes, the motives were different, however the contribution will always remain. Another major contribution, it is the setting up of archaeological survey of India, which could carry on the researches in the long run. Like today also we have this archaeological survey of India. It carries out various researches, it protects the monuments. So that is also a legacy of British rule. Okay, that is a major legacy, and this is how, even though the objectives of the British historians, it was not in India's favor, however, it brought a systematic way of looking at Indian history. But the biggest problem with this was this history that they were writing from which approach? Communal approach. They did not came out with the word ancient India, they said Hindu period. For the medieval India, they said Muslim period, and for the modern era, they used the word British period. They did not say Christian period, because that would give the overall advantage to all the Christians in the world. So that's why, to just specifically, they use the word British period. That's why you need to understand that this communal approach towards history, it starts from these colonial people itself, because they were a believer in the policy of divide and rule. That was the biggest problem, which was going to have a big impact on India and its politics. And the partition of India also happened because of this, the manner in which the history was written by the British. This is the first approach which we need to understand. When this approach came forward, eventually it was going to get countered. अब इसके ऊपर देखो यूपीएससी ने कुछ क्वेश्चंस पूछे हैं, ठीक है? डिस्कस द चेंजिंग, अब ये पीवाईक्यूज है, सिर्फ एनसीईआरटी बेसिस पे भी इनके अच्छे आंसर्स लिख सकते हैं. डिस्कस द चेंजिंग अप्रोचेस टू स्टडी ऑफ अर्ली इंडियन history. So the first approach we have just discussed, the second approach is going to be nationalist, third will be Marxist, and the fourth one would be subaltern. तो यही चार approaches आपको इसके अंदर लिखनी है. Even though such basic questions are now not coming in the exam, but अगर हम PYQ solve करते हैं तो हम directly इसके basis पे ये solve कर सकते हैं. Some of you may choose to write this answer, कल आप इसको लिख के लेके आ सकते हो. We can have a basic discussion on this question. अभी आगे भी और बात करेंगे. Now see, just read this paragraph. Ancient Indians had no taste for historiography. Their scholars cared more for religious, spiritual and philosophical studies. Indian historiography is essentially an Islamic heritage. Comment upon this statement with special reference to contemporary writers and their work, which help us in the reconstruction of the history of early medieval period of Indian history. Forget the second part, but if we just read this first 3 lines, again this is an attack on India's historiography of ancient times. So here what we have discussed, First, you will see that the first interpretation, it comes from Alberoni. It was Alberoni who said that, and from Alberoni, this was again was borrowed by the British, and they said it is an Islamic heritage. And how did they were justifying it? They were justifying it because majority of the Indian history, it was more of religious history. Like जब भी हम Vedic period भी पढ़ेंगे, so how do we know about the Vedic period? We know it from the 4 Vedas that we have, right? So India's history is a lot of mixing with the religious event. That's why they say that. However, if we see from today's point of view, we have to divide between historical consciousness and history writing. The historical conscious, it was already there, and within the history writing traditions also, there are 2 types of tradition: the externalized form and the embedded form, and India is an example of embedded form. So we cannot discard that India was not having any kind of history writing. Okay, later on you'll understand even more about this, but I'm just giving you these perspective. थोड़ा सा सोचने का मौका मिलना चाहिए, बिकॉज इनिशियल हिस्ट्री बहुत इजी है, बट ये थोड़ा सा टेक्निकल पार्ट है कि कॉलोनियल हिस्ट्री के क्या पॉजिटिव नेगेटिव हमें समझने हैं. एनीवे, लेट अस नाउ डिस्कस द सेकंड अप्रोच, एंड दिस वाज द नेशनलिस्ट अप्रोच. Right, so the biggest problem with the colonial history was it was not keeping India's interest at the heart. History was written without bothering about किसी को फर्क पड़ता उससे नहीं पढ़ना. But then comes the challenge. The challenge came from the nationalists. So what did they do? They went for the counter action. The counter action was showcase the glorious ancient past. कि इंडिया में जो भी आपने टर्म सुने होंगे, dark age word comes from the British and the golden age word it comes from the nationalist. Like they added the word golden age to the Vedic period, they added the golden age to the Gupta period. So lots of period were given the title of the golden age, highlighting periods of cultural and political unity. A band of scholars took upon themselves not only the mission to reform Indian history in such a manner as to make case for social reforms and more importantly for self-government. Okay, like if we see about Cholas, we do have self-governance. So they started writing about it. R.G. Bhandarkar, he played an important role. K.P. Jaiswal was a famous historian, and he has written specifically about the 6th century BC when in India there used to be republics during the times of Mahajanpada. So all those researches were done by these people just to make British understand that whatever you are saying, it is baseless and you need to do further research. There is also the category of scholars with rationalist and objective approach, like people like Rajendra Lal Mitra, who published Vedic texts and wrote a book entitled Indo-Aryans. They started this research that who were Indo-Aryans, from where do these people came to India, and eventually this was a very important turning point in India, because when we realize that the lineage of the British and the Indians, it is same, it's the same Indo-Aryans, right? That gave a lot of confidence boosters to Indians. Reformers like R.G. Bhandarkar, right, through his research he advocated widow remarriage, castigated the evils of caste system, child marriage. Until 1960, the political history attracted the largest number of Indian scholars. So this remained a limitation of this school also. Like the British, their focus was on political history. Those were outsiders, and people from outside cannot understand about Indian history that easily, specifically the social history, because these people were divided along the classes, the economic term, but in India we were divided along the caste, which was more of a social term, which was not existent in the England, or for that matter in the whole of Europe. That kind of stratification was not there. So that's why initial researches, they were mostly towards political history, and which also glorified the history of respective regions or dynasty lines. Those who wrote India at a pan-Indian level were inspired by the ideas of nationalism. So one problem which erupted with this school is that they started saying that Indians were having nationalism from the times of ancient India, and that is something which is a bit conflicting view, right? Because when we talk about the word of nationalism, nationalism is a very modern phenomena. In India, the nationalism starts from the later part of 19th century. Okay, so that's why using these terms freely just to come up with an answer against the British rule, I don't think that's the right approach towards writing history. So that became a major limitation of the nationalist school. Then in contrast to the book of V.A. Smith, who gave almost 1/3 of the total space to Alexander invasion, Indian scholar gave their subject much less space. On the other hand, they stressed the importance of dialogue of Porus with Alexander, Chandragupta Maurya's liberation of northwest India from the Seleucus Nicator. And despite criticism, their interpretation provided a counter narrative to colonial views, shaping modern understanding of Indian history. तो एक बहुत बड़ा contribution इन लोगों का क्या रहा, that irrespective of the approach which they were following, the approach was very much similar to that of the British, that they were only writing which kind of history? Political history. They were not going for diversification. At max, when they shifted from political history, the diversification was more towards the religious history, like we've just seen that the text Indo-Aryans. So that's why the limitations remained, and we required further changes. We required further changes with respect to Indian history, and those changes came with the coming of Marxist approach. The Marxist approach, as all of us know, it focuses on economic interpretation of history, and they gave a lot of stress, okay, towards social, economic as well as cultural processes. This was a significant shift in history writing. One of the earliest person to go toward this, it was A.L. Bhasham. I hope all of you know about his book, The Wonder That Was India. It's a famous book that we have, 2 volumes are there. So as a British historian, he learned Sanskrit, questioned the wisdom of looking at ancient India from the modern point of view. This is very, very important. You cannot question today that was Neolithic period में nationalism था कि नहीं था. You cannot use the term nationalism in Neolithic era. Hardly few people are there. How can you say nationalism? How the borders were going to be on those times? Visa होना चाहिए था उस time पे. So going about using the today's ideas and unnecessarily projecting them on ancient India is not going to work. That's why it became important. His earlier writing showed his deep interest in the materialistic philosophy of heterodox sects. So he wrote about Buddhism, he wrote about Jainism. Later he believed that the past should be read out of curiosity and pleasure. In his book, The Wonder That Was India, it's a very important book, and this is without any kind of prejudice towards the Indian civilization, right? Then within India itself, we see rise of tall figures like D.D. Kosambi. D.D. Kosambi said history should not be read without taking into the context geography of the region. तो पहली बार किसी ने geography को ज़्यादा importance दिया with respect to history writing, that was D.D. Kosambi. Okay, so he says that the same shift is evident in his book An Introduction to the Study of Indian History, which later popularized in the civilization of ancient India. This school was bound to have a major impact on history writing, because whatever researches were required in the domains of society, economy and culture were going to be required in the long run. But इस school के साथ भी कुछ limitations थी. One major limitation is that even though they were researching on various wide trend, but the major focus remained upon economic trend, and they started importing all the major phenomena from European history. Like unnecessarily, they used the word feudalism, which may or may not have been there during the early medieval period. Yes, so इन्होंने import करना शुरू किया कि feudalism Indian history में लगेगा कि नहीं लगेगा. Second, they started using the concept of class on a larger scale. If we see the Marxist viewpoints of history, they believe in the class struggle between the bourgeois and the proletariat. So such kind of things were implied to Indian history, which in itself is blatantly wrong, because in India, what is more important, caste or class? It is always going to be caste. Class can be there, but a minor factor. It can never be a major factor. So that's why this school also had certain limitation. However, this school has continued, has helped us in understanding about our Indian history in a major way. We read NCERT of R.S. Sharma. R.S. Sharma, he was also a follower of Marxist school, right? So Romila Thapar, again a follower of Marxist school. So all the major researches which have been done in India just after independence, those researches have been done by the Marxist. Then by 1980s, a new school started emerging, and this school is known as Subaltern School. Initially, Subaltern School, it was just a area of study within the school of Marxist, but later on it became a full-fledged school, and the person who was responsible for this school, it was Ranjit Guha. The word subaltern means people who are not represented in history. They should be given more representation, more research should be done on those people who are having no role in the history. Like if you see largest category of people who have lived throughout history, they have been peasants, but they are not represented anywhere. Okay, similarly, ये आपसे इंटरव्यू में पूछा भी जाता है that history is his history or her history. The meaning is his history or her history. Why? Because women are not represented in history that well. Like you see ancient India, medieval India, कितनी बार पढ़ते हैं हम the role of women in the history? It's very much limited. So that's why this school subaltern history was going to focus on those areas which has further so far not given any kind of space. Even tribal history, what has been the role of tribes? We only read about the mainstream religions, right? What is the role of these tribal gods, goddesses? What is about their religion? So that's why when we start delving into these areas, we see the role of this subaltern school. So right now, the most important approach which is going on in the history writing, it is known as multidisciplinary approach, which is not limiting itself to any one school. Okay. So right now, the most important approach that we see with respect to history writing, like you see, the classic example of this approach is the book of Upinder Singh, because she is trying to be neutral when she is writing history. She's just saying that whenever we read about any specific topic, these four viewpoints come. I agree to this extent with this school, then I agree to this extent with second school. So this, in this way, history writing, okay, a more clear history writing approach is this multidisciplinary approach. In areas where there is contestation, you can write very properly that there is a contestation in this part of the history. We do not know the exact outcome क्या होने वाला है इसका, because further researches are going to be required in the future. You don't have to take stand. Like if you read a book, you'll see like that the impact of climate change on Indus Valley civilization is inconclusive. So somebody who is accepting कि भाई हमें नहीं पता, that is a part of multidisciplinary. Otherwise, those people who are recognized is with one or the other school, they will always say कि नहीं ये हुआ है, खत्म कहानी, हमारा यही आंसर है final. Right, that's why the best approach today, it is multidisciplinary approach, where you see the viewpoints of various historians and not just ridiculizing someone only on the basis of their school of thought. ऐसा नहीं होना चाहिए. And this is going to create lots of diversity in the history writing in the coming times. That's why if we see what kind of history should be written in India in these times, तो इंडिया में अगर हम हिस्ट्री की बात करें तो we are going to focus on what kind of history? रीजनल हिस्ट्री. इंडिया में देखो आज भी रीजनल हिस्ट्री पे थोड़ा फोकस कम रहता है. वाई? बिकॉज वी सी इंडिया एज अ नेशन एज इट इज टुडे. दिस इज नॉट हाउ इट यूज्ड टू बी. इट यूज्ड टू बी वेरी डिफरेंट इन द एंशिएंट इंडिया. दैट्स व्हाई वी शुड फोकस ऑन रीजनल हिस्ट्री. We should focus on those areas which have been completely out of Indian history. Like if you see Northeast, very few part we study from there. We should focus on the role of women. We should focus on understanding of syncretic traditions of India rather than dividing against each other. We should focus on the understanding of syncretic traditions. There are lots of new researches which is going on in universities. In the coming times, we're going to see lots of researches on these topics. चल ही रहा है इन सब के ऊपर, तो हम सब लोग इसके ऊपर आगे की क्लास में बात करेंगे. But let us just cut short our discussion. That I hope you're able to understand how many schools are there. 4 schools are there. सबके अपने positive negatives हैं एक basic level पे. And if you wish to write an answer, तो आप पहला क्वेश्चन अगर पढ़ेंगे तो डायरेक्टली आप आंसर इसका लिख सकते हैं. Discuss the changing approaches to the study of early Indian history. Discuss. इसमें आप आराम से सकते हो. ठीक है. दिस वाज द फर्स्ट पार्ट जो कि एनसीईआरटी से हमने बोरो किया है. अब कुछ माइलस्टोन्स हैं देखो हिस्ट्री राइटिंग में. जैसे अगर हम बात करें, या आप टाइमलाइन को याद भी कर सकते हो, कभी कभी प्रीलिम्स में पूछ सकते हो. मोस्टली इंपॉर्टेंट यहां तक रहेगा. ठीक है. लाइक सेकेंड हाफ ऑफ 18th century, दिस वाज अ टाइम वेयर मॉडर्न रिसर्च इन द हिस्ट्री ऑफ एंशिएंट इंडिया बिगिन. देन 1765, as all of us know, Diwani rights in Bihar and Bengal came under rule of East India Company. 1776, Manusmriti, it was translated and the name given to it was Code of Gentoo Laws. Then 1784, Asiatic Society of Bengal was founded, which was going to do important role with respect to Indian history. 85, Bhagavad Gita was translated. 1804, Bombay Asiatic Society was founded. 1823, Asiatic Society of Great Britain was founded in London. Then Chair in Sanskrit established in England and several other European countries. 1904, an important book known as Early History of India. This was brought back by V.S. Smith. 1924, Hindu polity by K.P. Jaiswal, who even talks about the republics of 6th century BC, which is even older than that of the Roman and the Greek civilization. So this is how major role has been played by various people. And after independence, as we have seen, 1951, it was the wonder that was India by A.L. Bhasham, and 1957 is the introduction to the study of Indian history by D.D. Kosambi. These are the most important events with respect to the beginning of Indian history. तो एनसीईआरटीज में टाइमलाइन दिया हुआ है, वी हैव जस्ट एडेड दिस इन द पीपीटी, जिसको आप थोड़ा सा देख सकते हो, नाम याद रख सकते हो दो चार लोगों के, बिकॉज कभी कभार आपसे पूछ लिया जाता है कि विच आर द इम्पोर्टेंट हिस्टोरियंस ऑफ एंशिएंट इंडिया, तो बहुत सारे हैं, जितना मन करे उतना याद कर सकते हो, ठीक है, बट आई विल ऑलवेज से लिमिट में रहना हो, दो चार का नाम याद रखो, अच्छे से उनके बारे में जानो, एंड दैट इज द एंड ऑफ इट. Okay, so this was the first part which we were required to discuss. Now, when we see history as a subject, okay, how did it become a scientific subject? ये बना कैसे? इसकी खुद की हिस्ट्री की एक ओवरऑल अगर हम क्रोनोलॉजी को समझे, okay, so how do we see the scientific foundations of history? Who is known as the father of history? The father of history is known as Herodotus. Yes, the beginning of history writing can be traced to ancient Greeks. Herodotus is considered as the father of history because the history he wrote was humanistic as well as rationalistic in nature. So he is known as the father of history. Rise of scientific inquiry, if we see from the point of view of Europe, okay, so scientific inquiry वहाँ पे most prominent becomes by the time of Renaissance, and after Renaissance they developed the overall system of opening of museums. And what are the museums? Museums are about preserving the previous histories. So ये part became important from 14th and 15th centuries in the world. Thereafter, development of ideas of stratigraphy, which are very important for archaeology, because whenever you go for excavation in any place, कहीं भी जाके करोगे, सबसे पहला आपको किस चीज का ध्यान रखना है? Stratigraphy. Otherwise, what you will do, you will come up with objects which may belong to different periods, but you will put them together in a single category, which is going to be a big problem. That's why development of ideas of stratigraphy, Darwin's theory of biological evolution, okay, the discovery of human and animal fossil, all this has helped in the development of history as a scientific subject. Then archaeology, as all of us know, without archaeology, can history remain? History cannot get the final perspective without archaeology. Anthropology, even more important, we have to understand about the evolution part of humans. Then paleoanthropology is the study of human ancestor and their evolution by the study of the fossil remain. Stratigraphy, as I've already told you, is the study of origin, nature and relationship of rock and soil layer that were formed due to natural and cultural activities. We'll talk a little bit more about it. And now, how do we estimate the time period of any specific fossils on the basis of radiocarbon dating? अब थोड़ा आगे हम और पहुंच चुके हैं, हम न्यूक्लियर डेटिंग भी यूज करते हैं अभी के लिए. Okay, but all this has helped in the development of history as a scientific subject. ये सारे Hi, a very good evening to all of you. I'm Vikas Ahlawat. I'm a former civil servant. I was able to crack UPSC twice. In fact, in 2018, I was able to get highest marks in history optional, and they were around 324. So this year, I'm coming up with a series which I'm calling Self-Study History Optional. इस series में 100 से ज़्यादा वीडियो होने वाले हैं, which are going to cover the different nuances of ancient, medieval, modern as well as world history. So those of you who are preparing for 2025, register करिए and try to get the maximum out of this specific initiative of ours. So at Prepcareer IAS, we are producing results from last many years. 2023 में बहुत सारे टॉपर्स हमारे इंस्टीट्यूट से थे. 2022, 21 हर साल बहुत अच्छे टॉपर्स यहाँ से निकले हैं. And they have been able to get very good marks in history optional. So those of you who are thinking कि यार start करके कितना कर पाएंगे कितना नहीं कर पाएंगे, we already have achievements with us. I was able to achieve, my students are achieving, and you can be the next. इन सेशंस में क्या होने वाला है, नंबर 1 विल बी फोकसिंग ऑन फाउंडेशन ऑफ बेसिक कंसेप्ट्स स्टार्टिंग फ्रॉम व्हाट इज हिस्ट्री, व्हाट इज हिस्टोरिकल पीरियड, व्हाट इज प्रोटो हिस्ट्री, व्हाट इज प्री हिस्ट्री, बेसिक लेवल. ओके. सेकंड, अलाइनमेंट विद यूपीएससी सिलेबस. जितना भी हिस्ट्री ऑप्शनल का सिलेबस है वो 51 पार्ट्स में डिवाइडेड है. सो वी आर गोइंग टू अलाइन ईच एंड एवरी कंसेप्ट विद द सिलेबस इटसेल्फ. नंबर 3 वी आर गोइंग टू फोकस ऑन आंसर राइटिंग. ऑल ऑफ यू नो कि जो मेंस है वो ऑब्जेक्टिव नहीं होता है, वो सब्जेक्टिव लेवल पे होता है और आप सब लोगों को आंसर राइटिंग सीखना शुरू करना पड़ेगा, है ना. वी डू नॉट हैव टू मच ऑफ टाइम, तो स्टार्टिंग से ही आंसर राइटिंग शुरू करेंगे. एंड नंबर 4 द ओवरऑल पैकेज इज़ वेरी हॉलिस्टिक इन नेचर. तो अगर आप इसको अच्छे से कर लेते हैं तो जो बेसिक लेवल फाउंडेशन हिस्ट्री ऑप्शनल की वो कंप्लीट हो जाएगी. यू आर गोइंग टू गेट मैनी इंपॉर्टेंट थिंग्स अलॉन्ग विद दिस. ओके. 100+ सेशन है, चारों पार्ट कवर होंगे. थीम वाइज सेग्रीगेटेड डायग्राम, फ्लो चार्ट, जितने भी इंपॉर्टेंट एनसीईआरटीज हैं. देखो अगर हम सारी एनसीईआरटीज को कंबाइन कर दें, एंशिएंट, मिडिवल, मॉडर्न वर्ल्ड ऑफ वेरियस बोर्ड्स ऑफ इंडिया, तो 25 से 26 एनसीईआरटी निकल के आती हैं. उन सबको हमने कोहेरेंट फॉर्म में डिज़ाइन किया है सो दैट यू कैन लर्न द बेस्ट फ्रॉम दैट. ओके. बिकॉज देखो हिस्ट्री में रिसर्चेस चलती रहती हैं. अभी तमिलनाडु की जो एनसीईआरटीज हैं दे आर मोर इंपॉर्टेंट इन कंपेरिजन टू द रीसेंट हिस्ट्री देन द प्रीवियस हिस्ट्री जो कि आर एस शर्मा वगैरह, सतीश चंद्रा या फिर बिपिन चंद्रा ने लिखी हैं. That's why we are covering all the NCERTs and that's why 100+ सेशंस हो जा रहे हैं टोटल मिला के. देन 30+ वैल्यू एडेड आपको डॉक्यूमेंट मिलने वाले हैं, डेडिकेटेड आंसर राइटिंग सेशन मिलेंगे, जूम सेशंस भी करेंगे बाद में ताकि आप लोगों की जितनी भी डाउट्स हों विद रिस्पेक्ट टू लर्निंग दे कुड बी सॉल्व्ड. ओवरऑल जो है आपको क्लास की पीपीटीज मिलेंगी, कंसेप्ट लिस्ट मिलेगा, पीवाईक्यूज, जितने भी पीवाईक्यूज हैं उनको अच्छे से हमने डिज़ाइन कर दिया ताकि आप सब उनको अच्छे से पढ़ सकें. माइंड मैप मिलेंगे पूरे सिलेबस के, वर्कबुक और लर्निंग असाइनमेंट्स मिलेंगे एंड सेल्फ असेसमेंट टेस्ट सो दैट वंस यू लर्न समथिंग तो साथ में उसको एटलीस्ट इवेल्युएट भी करना चाहिए ना कि भाई हमें कुछ समझ में आया भी है, नहीं आया, एटलीस्ट जितना रिक्वायर्ड है वहाँ तक पहुँचे हैं या फिर नहीं पहुँचे हैं. तो आपको करना क्या है, व्हाट वी नीड टू डू दैट, सबसे पहले आप रजिस्टर कर लीजिए. ठीक है. आपको एक स्पेसिफिक गूगल शीट मिलेगा, उसमें आप रजिस्टर कर लीजिए. देन एज ऑल ऑफ अस अंडरस्टैंड हर किसी के पास लिमिटेड स्लॉट्स हैं, तो आपको एक स्पेसिफिक कॉल आएगा एंड दैट इज समथिंग विच वी आर कॉलिंग एट स्क्रीनिंग प्रोसेस. बिकॉज अगर हमें आपको ये सारी सर्विसेज प्रोवाइड करनी है, द नंबर ऑफ स्टूडेंट्स विच वी कैन हेल्प दे आर ऑलवेज लिमिटेड इन नेचर. सो अकेडमिक काउंसलर इज गोइंग टू कॉल यू, दे गोइंग टू हेल्प यू और दे गोइंग टू अंडरस्टैंड आपकी रिक्वायरमेंट क्या है. हो सकता है आप कॉलेज के फर्स्ट ईयर में हो, सेकंड ईयर में हो, थर्ड ईयर में हो, और यू मे हैव ऑलरेडी प्रिपेयर्ड फॉर सम टाइम एंड यू आर नॉट गेटिंग द डिजायर्ड रिजल्ट. तो इसलिए हमें स्क्रीनिंग प्रोसेस चाहिए होगा. एंड फाइनली ऑन द basis of this you're going to get the benefit of this program.